Thank you very much for turning up to listen to me talk about William Morris, someone who's been important in my life for a long, long time. And I was fortunate enough a few years ago to be able to devote some time and study what Morris did and wrote in some detail, and the result of which is the book William Morris and the Instinct for Freedom. Morris, as most of you will know, was a remarkable person. Born in 1834, died in 1896. He was an artist, poet, designer, businessman, printer, publisher, and of course a pioneer socialist. He was someone who had tremendous energy, and he was loved and respected and admired by virtually everyone he came into contact with in his own life, and that admiration and love has continued ever since. For Morris, the past was really important, and as L.P. Hartley wrote at the beginning of The Go-Between, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Well, they certainly did, and the problem for Morris was that his own present time, he felt, was slightly out of joint. So he often looked to the past for inspiration, looked for ways in which people in the past did things differently. And not only did things differently, but did things in a better way, in a more communal way, in a way which actually enabled people to develop fellowship with one another. His times were out of joint. It was a time in the 19th century of massive changes. Obviously, the railway was changing means of communication. It was going through the countryside, devastating areas, what we would say, of natural beauty. It was creating new landscapes, creating work too, but also creating ugliness. He wrote this in 1894. If we raise a building, whether it be a palace, factory or cottage, it must be a thing well understood, that it must be sightly. If a railway has to be run from one place to another, it must be taken for granted that the minimum of destruction of natural beauty must be incurred, even if that should increase the expense of the line largely. He wrote that in 1894, and you might be able to say that now with a certain rail development which is going towards the north. So the railway was improving in many ways people's lifestyle. Morris was actually a user. He used it for his business, to travel all over the country to his clients. He used it to go up and down the country to give his many socialist lectures, but he also had problems with it. In News from Nowhere, he talks about having experienced a vapor bath. And if you understand what he experienced, then you'll see why. This is a picture of one of the first steam trains on the District Railway, the London Underground, which came into service, I believe, in 1863 and came out of service in, would you believe, in 1963. And I was on Ravenscourt Park tube station last year when it came through. And what struck me was not just the smoke, but the noise. And I think sometimes we forget that the 19th century was an incredibly noisy place. There was noise pollution as well as smoke pollution. And although the railways did provide a great deal of opportunity for people, they also destroyed opportunities for others. Building the London Underground meant the destruction of a number of homes as the railway cut through London and into the suburbs. He also looked around him and saw the times being out of joint, particularly in the working people. And in the 1880s and 1890s, there was increasing concern about not only poverty in urban and rural areas, but the hardships people faced in their workplaces. The White Slaves of England was a book which looked at alkali workers, chain makers in Birmingham, coal miners, and all sorts of other people who experienced this tremendous hardship. And in the 1880s and right into the beginning of the 20th century, women also worked in areas which demanded a great deal of physical energy. And Morris was a person who felt that no one, and certainly women, shouldn't have to do such hard work, such drudgery, which he felt, if at all possible, could be done by machines. One of the things he also did in his socialist days, certainly, was to support trade unions and trade union action, workers' protests against their conditions. In Commonweal newspaper he edited and published for a number of years, he would support strikes and other disputes in order to give heart and to help working people to get a better life. This is the Matchgirls Strike of 1888. And one of the problems which they had to suffer, apart from extremely low wages, was the industrial effects of the phosphorus, which caused what was known as phossy jaw. He wasn't a great enthusiast for trade unions because he wanted something more. And when he went around London and other cities, he would see areas where the poor people like the match girls and the chain makers actually lived. This is a slum known as the Old Nickel in Shoreditch. And one of the people he knew quite well, Frank Kitts, who was a comrade within the Socialist League and helped edit Commonweal, lived in the Old Nickel. And he wrote, "No one would build such dog hatches for their own sake. There is no insuperable difficulty in the way of lodging people in airy rooms decently decorated, in providing their lodgings not only with good public cooking and washing rooms, but also with beautiful halls for the common meal and other purposes." He thought the world could be better. This is the way too many people lived, and he wanted that to change. He would also see how people were being brutalized by industrialization. And he wrote to a friend and comrade after visiting Frank Kitts in the Old Nickel, "I called on the poor chap at the place he lived, and he fairly gave me the horrors to see how wretchedly off he was. So it isn't much to wonder that he takes the line he does." And Frank Kitts was one of those anarchists which Morris associated with. He was one who looked to revolution, looked to violent change. And although Morris for a time embraced the idea of violent change as the only way in which the world could be put back into joint, he also believed towards the end that this wouldn't happen, and it would be necessary to look at other ways in which change could be effected. These photographs of child poverty, of malnutrition, starvation, of brutality were actually not taken in London, but were taken in Liverpool in the 1890s. These are the types of children he would have seen in the Old Nickel in London and in every industrial city in his time. Morris, of course, came from a very different background. He was upper middle class. He started his adult life with a private income from shares his father bequeathed him, about £900 a year, I believe. He was someone who enjoyed companionship and art and community. He was able to put his ideas, which were developing, into practice. What Morris wanted to do was to bring his love of the past to the present, bring out what was good in it, and that was in the art, in the architecture, the work, the fellowship, and the comradeship which he experienced. But this was Morris's world too. It was the world where increasing numbers of manufacturers, retailers, were selling their goods. One of the last things Morris did was talk about publicly the pollution of the built environment and the countryside by billboards. He also commented on more than one occasion about women's fashion. He didn't like women being dressed up, upholstered like armchairs, he said. He wanted women and other people to dress more naturally in fluid clothing, something which would free the body, enable them to enjoy their own bodies and the natural world. So, for Morris, capitalism was a vampire. And when he became politically, I was going to say motivated, but politically inspired in his mid to late 40s and the late 1870s and early 1880s, his idea was that reform was something which may be good in itself but would never go far enough. So, as I mentioned before, he was involved first of all in a socialist movement, the first socialist Marxist party, Social Democratic Federation, which he left to set up the Socialist League, which lasted for about 5 or 6 years. This is a photograph of the group of revolutionaries in the Socialist League taken in his own garden in the late 1880s, Kelmscott House in Hammersmith. Commonweal was a journal he published every week, bankrolled it in many ways. And for Morris, the Socialist League, Commonweal, his lectures and all his writings was about educating people about the change which not only was needed but could occur if they really put their minds to it and acted. He wanted to make socialists. Change could never happen unless people were able to see the world differently and act upon that difference. One of the things he did was produce a range of political pamphlets, Useful Work and Useless Toil, which has been published and republished many times, True and Full Society, Monopoly, How Labour is Robbed. For Morris, the problem was industrial capitalism, not providing working people and others with an experience which enabled their own creative endeavours to flourish, their own creativity. They were not getting not just a fair deal, but they weren't able to become, in effect, fully developed human beings. Not only that, industrial capitalism was producing more and more rubbish. For Morris, he thought that the Victorian era of mass production was producing makeshift, shoddy goods. It was creating, uglifying the environment, if that's the word. And Morris wanted to do something else. He wanted to show that it was possible to provide people with good, creative, satisfying work, which would produce beautiful goods, which would be durable and last, which would enable people to live a life in which they recognise that the world was and certainly could be a beautiful place. This is a picture of Burton Abbey Works, his own workshop in what was then Surrey, now South London. This was the area in which his own company, Morris and Company, produced a lot of their goods, their wallpapers, their tapestries. The people there stayed with him all their working lives. The hours were good, the pay was good in comparison with what they got elsewhere, and although it wasn't a cooperative or a profit-sharing enterprise, some people stayed the whole of their working lives there. The goods, of course, which were beautiful and durable, were also expensive, and that troubled Morris. But you must remember that one of Morris's criticisms of industrial capitalism was that it was producing lots and lots of stuff which was disposable, which was rubbish, which would be thrown away, which would then be replaced by other ugly rubbish, which would in turn be thrown away. The simple life came at a price, but it also came with benefits. And that benefit was actually having a life which was worth living. The simple life, the simple designs which Morris and Company produced, this is one of their favourite and most popular lines. The Sussex rush-seated chairs were often based on vernacular designs. And as you can see, this is some photographs from Gertrude Jekyll's book, not of Sussex, but of old West Surrey. So he looked to the countryside, to the simple life which the artisans, the craftspeople manufactured, created. The designs which they themselves were party to, and their ancestors, which they fashioned with their own skill, and which lasted for years and years and years. His inspiration was not just the artisan designs and the artisan work, but the countryside, nature. He looked at nature intently. He copied nature, reworked nature in his design work. And these designs are still with us. I've got curtains which I imagine are also adorning other people's rooms too. Beautiful, intricate designs based on the natural world, a world which Morris loved and he saw being destroyed in his own time, defaced. And it was from nature, which for Morris was not only an inspiration, but which created the true wealth. Wealth is what nature gives us, and what a reasonable man can make out of the gifts of nature for his reasonable use. The sunlight, the fresh air, the unspoiled face of the earth, food, raiment, and housing necessary and decent, the storing up of knowledge of all kinds and the power of disseminating it, means of free communication between man and man, works of art, the beauty which man creates when he is most a man, most aspiring and thoughtful, all things which serve the pleasure of people, free, manly and uncorrupted. That's from one of the pamphlets whose front cover you saw a few moments ago. One of his last ventures was the Kelmscott Press, private press movement, using traditional techniques. This is the Albion press he used. It wasn't up to date. It was early 19th century. There was a mix of handicraft and machinery. If Morris looked to machinery to do the arduous and heavy drudge work, he also looked to machinery, be a tool to help the craftsperson create beautiful things. These books, The Nature of Gothic, which was a chapter from Ruskin's Stones of Venice, in which Morris looked to not only as inspiration, but as really the template for which work should be like: artistic, satisfying, creative, productive, beautiful. And these are the workers who worked on the Kelmscott Press. There's May Morris there, sitting next to Morris in the centre. Although the chapel itself enabled men to be printers and to be members of the printers' trade union, which Morris supported, it did not at this time allow women. But Morris wanted to employ a woman, and he insisted and got the rules changed so that a woman did actually join Kelmscott Press, join the chapel, and like the other workers, earn something in the region of 5 shillings a week more than printers elsewhere. One of the things which Morris printed were his own books. And one of those was A Dream from John Bull, one of his political prose romances. Above the heads of the crowd, and now slowly working towards the cross, was a banner on a high raised pole, a picture of a man and woman half clad in skins of beasts, seen against a background of trees, the man holding a spade and the woman a distaff and spindle, rudely done enough, but yet with a certain spirit and much meaning. And underneath this symbol of the early world and man's first contest with nature were the written words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" The speech from John Bull, the priest, the preacher, who spearheaded the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, was actually reprinted many, many times by many different groups. Another publication was his famous utopian novel, News from Nowhere. And in News from Nowhere, he outlined in many ways his ideal society. A land where there was no private property, where everything was commonly owned. And although he didn't look towards communes and cooperatives as necessarily the way forward in his own time, he did financially support some. And this is the Coulsdon Colony and Free Community in Tyne and Wear. Nowhere was a moneyless society. It was a gift economy. He felt people were valuing everything in terms of how much money it was worth. It was defacing, deforming, degrading people as well as the environment. And he looked again to the past, to the way people worked, to people organized themselves cooperatively in guilds. The theory of industry among those guild communes was something like this: there is a certain demand for the goods which we can make, and a certain settled population to make them. If the goods are not thoroughly satisfactory, we shall lose our market for them and be ruined. We must therefore keep up their quality to the utmost. Furthermore, the work to be done must be shared amongst the whole of those who can do it, who must be sure of work always as long as they are well behaved and industrious, and also must have a fair livelihood and plenty of pleasure. Why should they not? The guild system, Wiiliam Morris in particular, was something which was taken up just before the First World War and after, promoted by, amongst other people, the Oxford academic and socialist G.D.H. Cole, who supported the building guilds, which were in effect workers' organisations who produced high quality housing for workers, of which there was a great need after the First World War, where people were working in them, enjoyed what they were doing, and possibly as a result of that, produced quality housing at a far lower cost than commercial builders. And being such a threat, the commercial builders lobbied local and national governments strenuously to stop local governments giving these building guilds contracts. Didn't last very long. But it was maybe a sign of things to come. So, if we are to understand Morris, I think what's important is to look at what he felt would be a decent life. And in How We Live and How We Might Live, he wrote these words. Well, I will now let my claims for decent life stand as I have made them. To sum them up in brief, they are, first, a healthy body. Second, an active mind and sympathy with the past, the present, and the future. Thirdly, occupation fit for a healthy body and an active mind. And fourthly, a beautiful world to live in. So if Morris looked to the past and he felt the present was out of joint, it was to the future, drawing on the past, changing the present, which Morris looked towards. So here we are. We need in many ways to look to the past and get inspiration from it ourselves. We need to think about all sorts of different ways of generating energy and doing things. The past is not a foreign country. The past is with us. We live it. And remember that our present will in the future be the past. I'd just like to say thanks to the Schumacher Institute, the William Morris Society, and the Birmingham and Midland Institute, which is suffering from lockdown at the moment, for helping to promote this event and this talk. Thank you.